Hi everyone. If you were to poll your average middle school Jewish day school students and ask them how many times was the Torah given, you would be amazed how many of them would tell you twice. Because after all, the Torah was given in Parshat Yitro, way back when in Sefer Shmot, and it's given again this week in Parshat V'Etchanan and Sefer Devarim, so it must be, it was given twice. Those of us who are a little bit more knowledgeable realize that really Sefer Devarim is just a recount of many things that have happened already. The Jewish people are about a month away from going into Eretz Yisrael. Moshe knows that his death is near and he will not be able to take the Jewish people into Eretz Yisrael. So what is he doing? He's recounting some of the events that happened in the desert. He's saying, remember that mistake you made? Don't do that again when you enter Eretz Yisrael. Remember this mitzvah or that mitzvah? Make sure you remember when you go to Eretz Yisrael and I'm not there to remind you. And that's Sefer Devarim. But there's one little problem. Some of the recounting that we say in Sefer Devarim is not exactly what happened when we read the initial story. The most famous example is in this week's Parsha, Parshat V'Etchanan, when we read the 10 Commandments. We read the fourth commandment, Shabbat, and the language in Parshat V'Etchanan is watch over Shabbos and keep it holy. But if you read the initial story, that wasn't the language. The word was Zachor Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho. Remember Shabbos and keep it holy. So what was said? If the Torah was only given one time, was Zachor said or was Shamor said? Which one was said? We know in Lecha Dodi, which we sing every Friday night, we actually reference this and we say, Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad. Those words were actually said at the same time, Zachor, Shamor. And when I teach this to my students, of course, they have to try to emulate God and see if they too can say Zachor and Shamor at the same time, which of course they can't. But there are many other examples of a different accounting. And some of them were mentioned last week in Parshat Devarim. One of them, we start off and Moshe says, remember right before we got the Torah in Parshat Yitro, I was so overwhelmed and I couldn't carry all the Jewish people by myself. I couldn't adjudicate all of the cases. So I got judges to be able to judge lesser cases. But if you read way back in Parshat Yitro, that's not actually what happened. It was Moshe's father-in-law, Yitro, who approached him and said, Moshe, you can't judge all these cases by yourself. You need judges to be able to adjudicate lesser cases. But in Parshat Devarim, Yitro wasn't even mentioned. Same thing where we mention the story of the spies in Parshat Devarim. The initial accounting in the story and in Sefer Bamidbar is completely different. There are so many different nuances, so many different changes in the story when we retell it in Parshat Devarim. So what actually happens? Is it the way it's initially told in the previous Parshiot? Is it what happens in Sefer Devarim? Why are there so many changes in the story? What is it coming to teach us? And I think one way that we can learn from this is to teach us that sometimes a different perspective can allow a story to change completely. Here we are, some of these stories being remembered 40 years later or 38 years later, and Moshe is able to look back at them and see them completely different. He's able to say, you know something? Back then, I didn't think I was overwhelmed by all the different people coming to me to judge their cases. But Yitro was able to see on my face something that I wasn't able to see, that I truly was overwhelmed, that I couldn't handle all of it. And Yitro was able to tell me something that I couldn't see in myself, but 40 years later, I'm realizing I really did feel that. The retelling of the story of the Meraglim is how Moshe sees it now, not how we saw it then. And perhaps Shabbos is the same story. Where they initially got Shabbos, every detail was new and they had to constantly remember, did I do this, did I do that? But now 40 years after keeping Shabbos, they're so used to it that they're not careful anymore. And therefore they have to watch over the Shabbos to make sure they don't take it for granted, to really watch over every detail so they don't mess up. And perhaps that's a lesson for us, that Parshat V'Etchanan is the Parsha read right after Tisha B'Av. And perhaps what it's teaching us is that perspective can offer us something completely different way of looking at a story. Perhaps it's referring to our rifts, that if we can see something from a different perspective, not that we'll agree with someone, but we can understand them. Perhaps it's teaching us, but the things that bother us in life, that drive us crazy, if we were able to see it in a different perspective, we would be able to see we really have so much, whereas a minute ago we were like, oh, my life is so frustrating. I have so little. Everything in life is truly about perspective. And if we can see something from a different perspective, it can offer a completely different story. And perhaps that's the lesson that we're learning by these Parshiot coming so close to Tisha B'Av. I want to wish everybody a beautiful Shabbos Nachamu and the gift that seeing things from a different perspective can allow us to have a much happier and more fulfilling and meaningful life. Shabbat Shalom.